This is Trump on Earth. I'm Reed Frazier.
Here comes the Green New Deal. It is
now a growing group of Democrats in Congress, pushed by grassroots progressives who want aggressive climate policies, are calling for a Green New Deal.
This plan is so diabolical, it's almost brilliant. And I say that.
A Green New Deal where the U.S. depends entirely on renewable energy. Have fun in those planes.
If Billboard had a top 100 for policy ideas, the Green New Deal would be at the top of the charts for several weeks running now. It's not a law or a bill or a policy. It's more a set of ideas right now that combines swift action on climate change with closing the inequality gap. Today, we're going to be talking about the Green New Deal with a reporter who's written about it extensively since it first came on the scene a few months ago. That's coming up in a minute. Stay with us.
Hi, this is Ruby Frazier, daughter of Trump on Earth co-host Reed Frazier. You can support Trump on Earth through Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/Trump on Earth. It's a great way to help the podcast out. Thanks. Back to the podcast. I'm so amazing.
Welcome back to Trump on Earth. On November 13th, a couple hundred activists marched into the Capitol, into soon-to-be Speaker Nancy Pelosi's office, demanding a Green New Deal.
Right now, young folks are filing in, sharing their stories, sharing their letters to Democrats, telling them why we need a select committee for a Green New Deal.
Just 2 months later, the phrase and the idea has spread quickly through America's political left. Already 45 Congress members have expressed support for it, led by newly elected House member Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
This is going to be the great society, the moonshot, the civil rights movement of our generation.
So what is it? The Green New Deal is a sweeping set of not even policies yet, more like aspirations that combine swift action on climate change with broad social and economic reform. Alexander Kaufman has been covering the Green New Deal for HuffPost, and he joins me now to talk about it. Alexander, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, first things first, tell us, what is the Green New Deal and where did this idea come from?
The Green New Deal is a general policy stance that says that in order to scale back emissions at the pace that scientists across the world say we need to avoid catastrophic climate change, we need to enact these very aggressive policies to phase out fossil fuels and to guarantee jobs to people in the industries that will be affected by it. So it is simultaneously a large-scale industrial plan that aims to prevent catastrophic climate change and aims to reduce growing inequality.
Where did this idea originate? I take it didn't just come out of nowhere in November.
It didn't come out of nowhere. The general concept of using the phrase New Deal, which obviously refers to the FDR program from the 30s and 40s, has been around in progressive circles for a long time. It really came into the mainstream first a little over a decade ago when you had pundits, avowedly centrist pundits like Tom Friedman, advocating for green stimulus packages in the wake of the recession. And it appeared in Barack Obama's 2008 presidential campaign. And then it kind of faded into political obscurity in the intervening years. You know, the recession really got bad. Austerity really became the philosophy of both the left and right ruling parties in the developed world. And there really wasn't much room for something like this. It was championed continuously by parties like the Green Party in the United States, but the constituency for that was rather small. And so what happened is early last year, there was a series of progressive left-leaning Democrats who were running in the midterms, including Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, Randy Bryce in Wisconsin, and all of them started talking about a Green New Deal as the platform for their climate policy. And since then, there were the protests, as you described, in Nancy Pelosi's office. And after that, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez proposed a resolution to establish a select committee on a Green New Deal. And that sort of helped to frame what it might look like, but it is still up in the air what a final actual Green New Deal would look like.
So you wrote that the Ocasio-Cortez is kind of taking up the mantle in November was sort of a breakthrough for the movement. Can you kind of describe what her role has been and why it's been important for promoting this idea?
The Green New Deal was something that she made a big deal out of early on.
This is not just about a Green New Deal. This is about a new deal for the United States of America. Because
just before she won her surprise landslide in her primary, I had interviewed her and she described what had been being talked about in progressive and in socialist circles at that point, which was, a World War II style mobilization of the entire economy focused on reducing emissions and rapidly scaling up renewable energy. And because her sudden primary win just propelled her to political celebrity in a way that we really haven't seen, in a very long time. She made this a cornerstone of what she was talking about. And, the timing of the protests in Nancy Pelosi's office and then her decision to join them really married the movement for this to her directly. And since then, she's continued to push forward and tweets about it pretty regularly.
Can you tell me how firm are the details of what could be in a Green New Deal? What are some of the ideas, the policies that would be included in this sort of umbrella of policies?
There are some core tenets to what the Green New Deal is, at least if you talk to the people who are the most vocal proponents of it. One thing is 100% renewable energy. The other goal is to do 100% renewable energy within about a decade. Some people say 2030. Other people say that's not as realistic, and so we should push for 2035. But that's the kind of time frame that we're looking at for that. The other aspect of it is potentially using a federal jobs guarantee, which is something that FDR had considered in the New Deal but wasn't able to accomplish, and which is something that has actually been proposed by a number of different Democratic senators who are running for president, including Cory Booker. And that policy has not been explicitly tied to green jobs necessarily, but if you look at polling and if you talk to some of the people who are pushing for a Green New Deal, they say that is one of the most important things because we need to be able to guarantee that people who are impacted by this radical overhaul of the way that the economy functions need to be guaranteed that they will have good-paying jobs that they can continue to feed their families with.
Yeah, and as we saw in France recently, when they tried to enact a sort of carbon tax or gas tax, there were riots. The gilets jaunes, the yellow vest, were just partially about people didn't want to pay more for their cost of living to go up. How important do you think bringing the language of FDR, the New Deal, into this policy idea is it for the people who are promoting it?
If you look at polling on things like a carbon tax, there is almost uniform support for a carbon tax among people who make up the regular policy elite and the type of people who kind of look at the world where humans act totally rationally. And, there was just yesterday, there was a big op-ed published in the Wall Street Journal signed by almost every living former Fed chair and a series of very high-profile economists calling for a carbon tax. And it's based on this kind of belief that, if we just tweak the market enough, capitalism will do the work of decarbonizing the economy itself. Now, that I think a lot of people think ignores some of the pain that those market tweaks can cause, and that is much less appealing to a regular average person who just wants to make sure that they can still feed their family and put their kids through school. So if you look at other polling, for instance, there was a big poll from the Yale Climate Communications program that showed that while only about 80% of people said they had not heard of a Green New Deal, when it was described, it had overwhelming support, and overwhelming support between the different parties. You had more than 90% of Democrats supporting that, and you had 57% of conservative Republicans, with 64% of Republicans overall saying that they would support something like that. So while there is a threat that once these types of policies are being championed by people that are perceived as very partisan or are perceived as very ideological, that support will wane, what that shows is that people do want these things, and that people understand that the government taking a really significant role in enacting a policy like this is a safe way to make the kinds of changes that need to be made to avoid what is coming down the pipeline right now. Pun intended with pipeline.
Yeah. Let's talk about some of that criticism that may be coming, or almost certainly surely will be. Dave Roberts over at Fox described the likely backlash against the Green New Deal as a giant smear campaign funded by effectively unlimited fossil fuel wealth, quote unquote. What types of things do we expect to come out of sort of Koch world and, maybe even not even the Republican Party, but also kind of more moderate Democrats of this policy or this idea?
Well, you can expect a lot of skepticism. I mean, there has not been full-throated support from Democratic leadership for something like this, in part because they are beholden not necessarily to the Kochs of the world or to the Exxons of the world, but certainly to the building trades like the IBEW and like the Longshoremen's Union, who really depend on the fossil fuel industry for very lucrative jobs. It's notable that the renewable energy industry is not organized. Overwhelmingly, it is non-union labor that builds a lot of the windmills and a lot of the solar panels in the United States. And in the years between when a lot of the fossil fuel infrastructure jobs were unionized, and now labor laws have steadily declined in a lot of places. So it's a hard sell to workers who can expect $25, $35 an hour for a pipeline project to tell them, actually, we need to terminate all of these projects as quickly as possible in order to, avoid the climate cataclysm that's coming our way, and we need you to instead take jobs in another industry that is not guaranteed to be unionized at this point in time, and which is will be conceivably more difficult to unionize than the fossil fuel jobs. So that's a big problem for the Democrats if they're pushing this.
Add one more plank to the Democrats' campaign platform for 2020, including from some likely presidential candidates. They will pull climate change, they'll put it front and center in 2020. Climate change.
When this starts to gain steam to the point where we have actual legislation on the table, it will be very likely that fossil fuel interests will play to those concerns. I think it's also notable that at the same time, when there's been a backlash to the Trump administration's push to expand offshore oil drilling, basically to all U.S. federal waters, that you have these new ad campaigns that are trying to tout the fact that the fossil fuel industry is a source of really good-paying middle-class jobs for people of color. So I think that you will also see a lot of the kind of social politics that you often see on the left being talked about also brought into this discussion when you have very powerful interests trying to oppose a Green New Deal of any kind.
So this idea, which Ocasio-Cortez is kind of ridiculed, but this question is bound to come up. How will you pay for all this? How will we pay for all this if we end up doing this?
Well, there are a few places to start. Obviously there's no legislation yet, but there are a few starting points. One of them is taking away fossil fuel subsidies. We give the fossil fuel industry almost $21 billion every year in federal and state subsidies, the majority of which come from the federal government. That is one place that you could start. Another place, as Representative Ocasio-Cortez has suggested, is to raise the top marginal tax rate on people who are making more than enough money to put them well into the 1% of the world's earners, and bring it back to where it was somewhere in the middle of the 20th century, when we had the greatest period of shared prosperity and middle-class growth in the United States history. Another way to consider it is just by deficit spending. There have been these deficit hawks in the Congress, really particularly under the Obama administration. You have a lot of Republicans who seem to make that the most important cause in the world when it was Obama spending money on health care, but when we were delivering $1 trillion in tax cuts to the richest people in the country and to corporations, that wasn't really a concern anymore for the party. But, when you talk to a lot of economists, there's this idea of modern monetary theory, which says essentially that a country like the United States is extremely unlikely to go bankrupt. And so deficit spending is not going to be a huge problem in the long term. And that is a smart way that you could pay for this without having to cut services in any other area.
Do you think, when you think about the Green New Deal, that this will require some sort of fundamental change in how people live their lives or how society is structured? I mean, it's almost certainly not going to be a seamless transition, I'm guessing.
Quitting fossil fuels will require a dramatic change. Fossil fuels are really entwined in almost every aspect of our lives. The plastic that we use, the cars that we drive, the airplanes that we take to go from place to place. But there's a lot of hope among people that if you were to really aggressively invest in these new industries, that while it would certainly change the way that the country functioned, partially because you would be able to address a lot of the social inequality issues that we live with today. In theory, you could easily have someone, a young mother go and get a job in this booming and federally backed clean energy industry so that she doesn't have to work 3 different low-wage, retail or food service jobs and still not be able to make rent or provide healthy food to her kids. You could see radical changes like that. You will also see people who have been very wealthy and who have been very powerful in this country because they have profited off this dirty and really lethal at this point industry for many years. So enacting something like this will undoubtedly shift a lot of different power structures in the country right now. And I think what you're getting at with the question is will this require behavioral changes from the average person? I don't know the answer to that. There are some people who argue that it's important that we, eat less meat, that we drive fewer miles, that we bicycle more. But those aren't options for everyone. There are some people who really require the nutrients that you get out of certain kinds of meat. There are people who are not, able-bodied, and vehicular transport is something that they really depend on. So I think that this provides a fresh opportunity to consider those things and to consider ways that a Green New Deal could enhance those services to people. But I don't necessarily think that it requires voluntary hardship from the average person in order to keep the planet from becoming uninhabitable.
Right. And there will be costs to climate change no matter what we do, and they're probably going to be more expensive than some sort of government transition to decarbonize the economy. But, people who live in rural America kind of need to drive to get to work, even if they're working at a solar panel factory. So definitely a big change in how we do basically everything in society.
there's a tendency when talking about decarbonizing the economy to think primarily about the electrical sector, to think about how we replace coal plants or gas-fired plants with wind turbines and solar panels. But the largest source of CO2 emissions in the United States by far is auto emissions. And so I think it's notable that, no one is saying, John in Wyoming needs to figure out a way to bicycle 30 miles to his job at the wind turbine factory. I think what people are hoping for is that these types of stringent mandates about fossil fuel use in the auto industry and these types of subsidies and support that the government would provide for doing research into electric vehicles would make for options that would allow people to live the lives that they're living, but do so in a way that isn't rapidly propelling us to, a very hot and a very violent climate.
Do you think this could have happened under, say, a Hillary Clinton presidency or some other quote-unquote normal presidency? I mean, is some of this kind of a reaction to President Trump and his stance on the environment?
That's a great question. It's certainly difficult to imagine what politics in the United States would be like had Hillary Clinton won the 2016 election. A lot of the people who were the early and most vocal champions of a Green New Deal were people that were inspired to run for office in part because they were reacting to Trump and they were reacting to the Democratic Party's establishment that failed to win that election and adequately combat the increasing right-wing extremism that had gripped the Republican Party in the last decade or so. That being said, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says that she was really inspired to run initially during the Standing Rock protests, and that happened under the Obama administration. And while Barack Obama did ultimately reject the permits for that pipeline, which was easy for Trump to reverse, and that pipeline is now built, that was really steadily happening under the Obama administration. And it's difficult to imagine that somebody like Hillary Clinton, who said she was in support of fracking and who did take a lot of donations from the fossil fuel industry, it's difficult to imagine she would have made her government a champion of a radical policy like this. So there's a lot of evidence that shows that the type of radical policy ideas that have come about, particularly around climate in the last couple of years, are a reaction to a federal government that has pursued an agenda that is so antithetical to keeping the climate in a safe temperature range.
Right. And I mean, the absolutely terrible, storms and the wildfires in California, those must have some sort of impact on the collective psyche and our collective understanding of, is climate change that big a threat? I think more and more people probably are going to say the answer is yes.
Yeah, I think about this a lot, honestly. It almost feels this is true of a lot of politics today, but it almost feels like television writing to some extent, that some of the most violent storms and wildfires and some of the most dire predictions from the UN's IPCC are coming out as we have a president like Trump. Perhaps it's a framing that's easy to fall into because President Trump, became most famous as a reality TV star. And as you kind of watch some of the most dramatic moments in his climate policy, for instance, when he was announcing his withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, it was months of back and forth hints, I'm going to, make a decision fairly soon and you'll see. And you know what, I'm actually considering not withdrawing from it. And I've been convinced by President Macron in France, or, you know what, actually, I think I'm going in this direction. And finally, there was a big staged press conference in the White House Rose Garden where he made his grand reveal. And, that against the backdrop of all of these violent images that we see of, burned out towns in California, of just absolutely devastated towns in Puerto Rico, of like these incredible death tolls that we're seeing from, from these storms and from wildfires. It's just so on the nose.
Yeah, it's like bad TV writing, right?
Yeah, exactly. That I find myself saying that exact phrase all the time. Like, if this was being written by TV writers, any good editor would look at this and say, absolutely not. This is way too obvious, and we're really treating our audience like idiots. We're living through this crisis. We're seeing how bad it's getting. Everybody who is not being paid by the fossil fuel industry is saying we need to do things that are radical, that are fast, and that are going to completely upend the way that the economy has functioned for the last few hundred years. And, the person in charge of the EPA was a coal lobbyist until the middle of 2017. The person right now in charge of the Interior Department was an oil lobbyist. I've covered different beats other than climate change. Before this, I was a business reporter. Before that, I was a media reporter. And, what drew me to this beat was that, it became clear to me several years ago when I started reporting on it that this was the most important story. And if we waited long enough, it would be the only story. And that there was a certain responsibility as a journalist to be an advocate for facts in a way that other beats didn't require. The two sides of a story, one of them was BS. One of them was being funded by one of the most powerful and entrenched industries in the world, and the other one were scientists just desperate to warn people about something that we don't even have the language to express the magnitude of. Seeing that play out the way that it is, perhaps it's appropriate that it's like bad TV writing, because there's just nothing. There's no other way that we can frame something this huge and this potentially impactful of every life on Earth, human or otherwise. And maybe TV is the best medium to help us to understand what's really at stake here.
Well, we'll be watching CNN and maybe Fox News to find out what happens with the Green New Deal, and we'll be following Alexander Kaufman in HuffPost to see what he writes next. Alexander, thanks so much for joining us.
It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Trump on Earth. I'm Reed Frazier. If you like our show, please consider supporting us through Patreon. It's a website. You just go to patreon.com/TrumpOnEarth, and you can help support our show. You can find us online at TrumpOnEarth.org. That's where we have all of our past episodes. One episode that's been getting a lot of burn lately is the Red State Paradox. That was episode 20. Look it up. We think it's pretty good. This is a production of the Allegheny Front, a public radio show covering the environment in Pennsylvania. We're at AlleghenyFront.org. Our producer and digital editor is Andy Cubis. Our executive editor is Kathy Nauer. My name's Reed Frazier. See you next time.